Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Anthropology 492, Anthropological Theory. It is week 6. We are down here at Symbol and Ritual. We'll talk about Victor Turner today, one of my favorites, and Mary Douglas on Friday. We didn't have class on Monday, so we're going to be rolling ahead. We're mostly caught up, I think, and we're going to be just on time for next week when we have paper. We have your test number 1, which is due just a little over a week from today. And remember, your test number 1 is going to cover everything that we've talked about in this class: early American, early British, material, French school and structuralism, symbol, and ritual. And it's going to be the same format of kind of short answer essay type questions that you see on your quizzes every week. So this week we got homework number 5, which is the same as always, your summaries and annotations. You've got quiz number 5, which again, the same as always, 3 questions that you answer. And then we got discussion board at number 6 on symbol and ritual, which you'll do like we always do, apply the perspectives of Turner and Douglas to study an aspect of modern American life. What does this perspective highlight, and what does it leave out? And next week I'll be gone, but I will be making a video for Monday about kind of instructions for your paper, because after test number 1, that's really what you got to kind of start on. It's going to be coming up soon. It's due just over a month from today, the 20th of March, and then your presentation is going to be due very soon after that, back on the 3rd of April. So we'll talk about that next week in 2 class periods, but I will be posting that. I'll also be posting a review, and I've already got a review sheet up, I think, pretty sure, for test number 1, which you can, yes, it is, which you can find right here. Okay. Any questions? We'll talk about this more next week, but that's just kind of where we're going. Two more big theorists to talk about before we get to the first test. So today we're going to talk about Victor Turner, one of my favorites. Where are you, Vic? There you go. Both for like professional reasons, scholarly, intellectual reasons, but also for personal reasons as well. Victor Turner was a British anthropologist. He was born in 1920, came up through kind of he's from Scotland, and we'll talk about him a little bit later in his life, but he ended up at University of Virginia before I got there. He died, but his widow Edie Turner was still there, and I took classes from her during my graduate career. And he had a picture up in their house. He's from on his father's side, some kind of minor nobility, and they have a picture in the house of the castle in the middle of the lake, which is like supposedly his castle if he had ever gone back to claim it. And then yeah, and his mother was a showgirl. She was an actress, which that was kind of a little scandalous at the time. But he has this kind of dual intellectual heritage of kind of science and kind of performance. And you might be like, how does that even fit together? But this kind of comes into his theory, especially that we're talking about ritual today. He studied poetry and the classics at University College of London. World War I breaks out in 1941. He gets drafted, serves as a non-combatant until 1944. He meets Edie Davis, who they end up getting married. She was kind of, again, lower class and was seen as kind of not quite scandalous, but beneath, like she's not of the same class as he is. But they get married, are married for 45, 50 years, have 5 children, a number of whom, children and grandchildren, go on to be anthropologists in their own rights. And I was good friends with his granddaughter, Rose, at UVA, and she gave our Cynthia Irwin Williams talk here a couple years ago, I think during COVID 2020, I believe. He, after 1946, goes back to school after the war, focused on anthropology, and graduates in 1949 with his undergrad, then goes to Manchester. to do his graduate studies and becomes part of this what's called the Manchester School of British Anthropology, um, and really kind of starts to work in looking at kind of this idea of ritual and symbolism, which is going to dominate not only this week, but some of the weeks going forward. His primary research is in Zambia. At the time, it was called Northern Rhodesia. And he worked primarily with the Ndembu people. And it's interesting, Rose always talked about her mother growing up in a Ndembu village as a kid and, speaking Ndembu as her first language. And, because she grew up right around these other kids. And his work at this time was really focused on kind of ritual, especially ritual among the Ndembu, as well as kind of the ritual process more broadly, which we're going to talk about this kind of pattern which we can use to think about ritual. And I think it's a good example of the difference between like good anthropologists and great anthropologists. Like a good anthropologist talks about their case study in one place, right? But a great anthropologist makes it about so much more, right? With whether it's Malinowski or Evans Pritchard, you're not talking about the Trobrians or the New Era. You're talking about kind of these big frameworks for seeing the world. Um, he moved to the United States in the 1950s, started working at the University of Chicago, and then they both moved kind of in the later years of his life to the University of Virginia, I think in 1980, 79 or 80, and he dies in 1983. But Edie keeps doing field work until I don't know, she died in 2020 or 2021, I believe. So just decades more of research and kind of not only keeping his own legacy alive, but doing field work of her own. Together they do field work on, she's doing field work on 5 different continents by the time she dies, looking at ritual, especially in all these different places. So we're going to kind of take a look at, there's 2 articles this week. If you take a look at it, they're combined them because they're both they're pretty short. It's less than 30 pages combined, and they go together if we're talking about symbol and ritual. And the first one is about his ideas of symbols in Ndembu ritual. And I actually, this is from a book. It's later kind of reprinted in as a book or part of a book, Forest of Symbols in 1967. Which becomes not only, there it is, not only important in like a ritual anthropology of ritual and symbolism kind of context, but also becomes the basis for kind of this vein or this thread in environmental anthropology about looking at people's relationship with specific parts of the natural world. As Maurice Bloch uses this as kind of the foundational work in his like early 2000s book, The Anthropology of Trees, looking at different kind of people's relationship with trees around the world. And I use this as kind of a starting point for my discussion of cacao. So tied into this pretty deeply. Where are we? There we go. So talking about ritual, um, when we talk about ritual, right, he says there's these 2 really important parts for studying ritual, and that's both the symbols as well as kind of the ritual process that go into this. And at the time, just as a little context, right, this is the mid 20th century in Britain, and a lot of and especially in the social sciences, there's this tension at the time between Evans Pritchard's crew of structural functionalists and those people who are interested in how societies function, especially right? It doesn't matter necessarily what happens to you as an individual. You're a piece of the machine, right? Like if you're the chief, uh, when you're dead, there'll be another person who gets to be chief, or if you're the medicine man or whatever, like you're playing a role within this larger society. And they will continue on after. It's this, Durkheimian idea of the superorganism. And then on the other side was the on social science, especially when from more the psychological side, was kind of the Freudians, right? This idea that the society part really doesn't matter. It matters, your internal states matter, right? Like what you think or these beliefs or these drives are all connected, especially to your ideas about, your mother or your parents or something like that. These really deep kind of unconscious urges. And it's mostly focused on the personal or individual level. And what Vic's real contribution was to take these 2 things and mash them together in a very kind of like take these two ideas which seem really antithetical to each other, and you come to some kind of synthesis. And he did this through looking at ritual, because he said for ritual, this is ritual is one of those places in society where we see kind of the encapsulation of both things, right? Ritual has two functions according to him, right? It has this personal function, right? It allows you to kind of think about your place in society and kind of how you fit into things and what you're doing. And then kind of it has this social function, right? It makes society go. You have these initiation ceremonies for people, or you have Christmas or Easter or whatever the ritual is, makes society go and brings people together. And so Vic's idea was this idea that you have to look at both of these together. Um, and he starts with symbol, right? This week is called Symbol and Ritual. And he, just like how Levi Strauss, we talked about on Friday, was looking at kind of like the atom of kinship, right? Vic was interested in the atom of ritual. What is the most elementary particle of ritual, right? These rituals come together, right? We think of something like Christmas, right? There's lots of pieces and parts. You got the colors, you got the gift giving, you got the food, you got the stories and the myth. But what's like how can we break it down to its most fundamental? And he says that it's the symbol, right? It's the smallest unit of the ritual, which still retain specific properties of ritual behavior. It is the ultimate specific structure in a ritual context. And in this book, Forest of Symbols, he uses the natural world, or he uses these rituals to talk about the symbolic properties of these three different trees in Ndimbu rituals. And we'll particularly look at this one called the milk tree today. And in his paper that you read, he says that when we as anthropologists want to study symbols, he gives you a nice little pattern to go by. He says, number one, when you look at a symbol in society, for example, we'll do one that we all know, right? Oh, American flag. There you go. American flag. It is a symbol in our society, right? And it's often used in ritual context, right? What's an example of that? How do we? Yeah, but how do we use it in rituals? What's a way we use it? Pledge of Allegiance, right? We also, starting of a sports game, right? We all watch the Super Bowl, or some of us watch the Super Bowl. Right? We got an American flag, and we're gonna sing the Star Spangled Banner, right? It's part of the Super Bowl is the ritual, but the flag is a piece of that, right? And we can use this flag in a whole bunch of different contexts, right? Whether it's starting off the Super Bowl or draped over a casket at a cemetery or something, right? The same symbol can function in different ways. He says that when we analyze any symbol, whether in our own society or in other societies, where'd my article go? We should use a three method. Where did you go? Oh, there you are. A three-pronged method of understanding. One is the external form and observable characteristics. So, for instance, what is the external form of this? What do we see just looking at it on like the most external?
Stripes and stars.
Yeah, stripes and stars, and we can even talk about what colors, red and white, right? And how many stars there are. This is our perspective on it without talking to anybody, right? And we can do this in another society. He talks about this tree, what's called the milk tree, and he says it has this physical characteristic that if you cut it, white latex comes out, right? And that's like another tree, you cut it and like red sap comes out. So there's these like physical properties that we as anthropologists can kind of see when we look at these symbols. So that's part one. He said, but that's not enough. Number two, we should ask people. This is where we're getting a little anthropological here, right? We should ask people what it means. Instead of just, looking at something, we can ask. Why might we ask somebody what this American flag means? And what can we get out of that? Yeah, and he makes a real good point here that you need to not only ask specialists, but you need to ask lay people as well. Why? Not only for the flag, but for any kind of symbol. Say, for instance, let's talk about church, right? There's a cross. We can ask the parishioners what the cross means, and we can also ask the priest or the preacher. Why might we want to ask both groups of people? Yeah, and how might they be different? Which do you think has a more complex answer?
Either like, what's the word? More of like a solemn tone, like, oh yes, Jesus died on the cross to like help us
Uh-huh.
with our sins. It's been a while since vacation Bible school.
Yeah.
And, other priests or people could use it as more of like a either faith symbol or
Mm-hmm.
a positive connotation, like that's not religion.
Yeah, he says that lay people often have that more like superficial level. Not that they're not like deeply thinking about it, but ritual specialists are more thinking about it all the time because that's what they do. So they're going to give you more complex answers, often kind of contradictory answers, right? The cross is like this, it symbolizes this, but it also is kind of like this, right? Just like American flag, right? So like, it's freedom, it's America. But some people might, who are more have a more complex understanding, right? It symbolizes kind of the American ideals, but also has this kind of different undertone. Maybe it's attached to colonialism or patriarchy or something, right? People will give you different answers. So it's important to talk to lots of different people. Don't just talk to the person who's in charge of whatever you're studying. And he says there, so you've got your first level looking at your second level of kind of asking people for interpretations. And then the third level is very similar to what he talks about, like to what you talked about with Levi-Strauss and this kind of structuralist idea that you should look at it as an outsider, right? Because oftentimes people will tell you things that maybe don't line up with what you see, right? That because they are in the society, they see things a certain way, or they're telling you what they've been told. But oftentimes, it can be very different. And he says gives this great example about the milk tree, right? It's the place of mothers, the place of lineages. It gets, there's this kind of symbolic movement from the white sap of the tree to breast milk, which gets turned into the matriline and kinship, which gets turned into all the Nadimbu tribe, right? So this tree, there's this really great, on the second level, he asks, what does the milk tree mean? And one of these more acculturated Nadimbu said, it's like our flag. Like you have a British flag, we have this milk tree, right? So he does these two levels, but he says that there's also this third level, right? He talks about how they will say that maybe this ritual around the milk tree is about unity, but in many ways it's about division, right? People will say it's about coming together of the tribe, but there's these oppositions between men versus women. Women will like chant and kind of make fun of the men. During this time, there's also this kind of opposition between mothers and daughters as the daughter is becoming initiated into womanhood and is being married off to a different group. So there's this kind of tension as the social group comes apart. So it's important for us because people in society don't necessarily talk about these things, but we as anthropologists can see it. He says that there's three properties of rituals, of symbolic behavior and rituals, or symbols and rituals. He says number one, they condense things. They take a whole bunch of stuff and they mash it down into one symbol. And you can see this in the American flag example, right? What does the American flag mean? Well, it's just a piece of cloth, but it means so much, right? It means freedom. It means democracy. It means capitalism. It means this geographic area that we live on. It means, mom and apple pie. All these different kind of things get mashed together into this one symbol. He says that they also are unifying things, and this is very similar to Marcel Maus's idea of a total social fact that we talked about a couple years ago, or a couple of weeks ago. Feels like years. This idea that it brings together different parts of society, right? So you're not just talking about religion, but it's talking about ties the social and the moral and the economic system together. And he says that there's also this kind of polarization between the sensory side and the ideological side as well. He differentiates between kind of on the lower level these instrumental symbols, which are means to an end. Oftentimes, like this tree is used to cure headaches or is used to cure diabetes or whatever. And they're very context specific versus what he calls dominant symbols, like the milk tree, which again are very total social facts. They seem to be ends in themselves and connect all these different parts of society together to make something more than themselves. And this leads into, so the symbols provide kind of the grammar or the vocabulary, I guess you could say, of, we'll say it could provide the vocabulary for these rituals, right? You see these trees and they mean different things. He says, but we can also look at the grammar of these rituals as well, right? And we can think of this as a linguistic metaphor, right? So in language, the words have specific meanings. They can mean multiple things, right? But they're strung together by a system of grammar. And he says that ritual is the same way. You have a whole bunch of different symbols which are strung together within this ritual grammar. And he draws on Arthur Van Gennep's early 20th century, 1909, 1910, writing about ritual, who says that within ritual, there are these three phases: the separation, the liminality, limin, or the margin, and the reincorporation or the aggregation, right? This idea that most rituals tend to follow this specific process where you are one state, then there's some ritual thing that happens and you are betwixt in between, as he likes to say, one state and the other. And at the end, you are reincorporated back together into your new state. And we see this, this is still pretty common, even in our own study. You don't have to travel to Nadembu land to see this in action, right? You can see it every time you go to a wedding or you go to graduation or you go to, if you graduate from boot camp in the army or something like that, right? You're going to go through these stages, right? You were one state before. We're going to do this ritual, and then at the end, you're going to be a different state. You were single. We do this marriage ritual, come out, you're a new state, you are a married person. You are an undergraduate, we do the graduation ritual. At the end, you are a college graduate, you're alumni, right? So this is a common pattern, a common grammar that rituals throughout the world focus on, or at least use to move people between these different states. And he's particularly interested in this middle state. And this is where his bigger contribution. Van Gennep comes up with this kind of three-part stage. But Turner says that we need to really focus on what goes on in this middle stage, the stage two, the liminal stage, the in-between stage, when people are no longer of one state or the other. And it leads to a very special kind of life, or a special kind of being for people in this state, right? So during this time, he gives the example of an Adembu boy's initiation ritual, right? You're a boy, and then after this, you go through this ritual, and then afterwards, you're a man. But in this middle time, it's a really weird, topsy-turvy kind of time. People are thought of as structurally dead. You're not a boy, but you're not a man. You're somewhere in between, and you don't make sense. You don't have status, property, or rank. Right? So if you're the chief's son, or if you are, commoner's son, you're going to be treated exactly the same during this ritual. This is just like in graduation. Nobody cares where you're from or what you do. You're all dressed the same and you're all doing the same walk across the stage. They're in this condition of sacred poverty, which is where you're not supposed to have a lot of stuff. You often don't have these kind of creature comforts, which you are used to. And there's kind of this implicit obedience to authority, right? This idea that you have to do what, while there's no status or property or rank between the people going through the ritual, you have kind of implicit obedience to the people running the ritual, right? So they are in charge. You have to do whatever they say. And it creates this kind of paradox in which the old is washed away through this, and you are recreated as a new person within this new status. And he calls this time, he's really interested in this idea of communitas, which arises during this time, which he says is the bond of structurelessness within a ritual. How can you have a bond of structurelessness? Isn't that kind of contradictory? Not exactly.
We're trying to obtain the same thing, so that there's definitely ties for those individuals together.
Yeah, that's what he talks about. He talks about how this is one of those kind of major social forces of social cohesion, especially in like Dembu study. He talks about this being a force of cohesion throughout their lives, right? So you go through this ritual together, whether you're the chief's son or the poorest guy in the village's son. You go through this big ordeal together of physical hardship, of pain, of suffering, and at the end, you're reincorporated into society as full men, right? But even though this time of structurelessness ends and you're reincorporating structure, the bonds between you last throughout your life. And there's these great, anecdotes he has about like, a commoner is able to go talk to the chief, even though they're a very different statuses because they went through this ritual together. And it's like, hey, remember back in the day, we went through that together, right? And we have this bond together. So I'm going to pause it here. I'm going to show you just a brief clip from this video on structure and communitas. And we're going to watch from about 5 minutes to 10 minutes or so. So if you're following along at home, you should switch over to, it is video number 6 on the watch list for this week. All right, so we are back. We just watched a little bit about what is communitas. Does any of you have an experience that you might have gone through where you experienced something like that?
Basic training.
Basic training, right? That's kind of the classic intro to the textbook kind of answer. Tell us about it.
Well, in my opinion, it's funny because everyone's reacting according to the structure, but no one knows what's going on necessarily. They're finding their way. So I think that's what makes everyone act in their own unique, in their own statement.
Yeah.
But you're not really anybody. You're in that liminal phase.
Yep.
Right? You're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and you have those real classic markers of that liminal phase, right? Your hair is cut, your clothes are taken away, you're given a uniform, all the distinctions, right? And all those kind of army movies, right? Where are you from? I'm Tex, I'm from Alabama, or I'm from Georgia, or I'm from New York, and then we put all these people of different races and ethnicities and together during this kind of crucible, which creates something new, right? You create these bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood with the people that you go through, right? And maybe are you still in contact with them? The deployment, yeah. 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 So you go through these experiences together and you create these bonds, your foxhole buddy or whatever, right? Because you go through this thing together that those people back there don't.
Experience.
Yeah, and it creates a special bond between you. How about anybody else? Did you feel like it field school maybe? Definitely. Especially if you go away for college, right? And you come back to your hometown after.
I don't know. Like my hometown here, I had a friend who's from like Michigan, and for her, that was like a complete different world than from here. But still, in like not knowing what we're doing, still finding people to, hang out with.
Yeah, and those become like your people, right? Especially even after you're done with the experience because you went through it together, right? And one of the things that kind of always comes out in like the undergrad version of this is the communitas seems really great. Like if you've ever been in one of those experiences, you're like, we made, like such great friends. And I was in language school in Guatemala, and all these people from different countries, and we all had these big adventures. And there's always one or two people who are just like, let's just keep the party going. Let's just keep doing this forever, man. But what's maybe the problem with trying to keep communitas going? It fizzles out.
Building a structure in itself.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Letting a new experience.
Yeah, and kind of the classic example is like a religious cult or new religious group, right? Oftentimes there's kind of religious effervescence. We see this across history and across continents, right? Where there's this like moment where people are in it, right? And they're creating this new kind of order, right? We're leaving behind what the old stuff, right? We're going to transcend creed and we're going to transcend, national origins or the rich people and the poor people, right? These kind of very communal religious movements, or even like the hippie movement, communal living has this kind of thing. But if you keep it going too long, you end up starting to create structure again, right? This kind of oscillation between structure and anti-structure. So Turner says that this is essential, right? That you can't just keep going in this kind of communitas state forever. It fizzles out or becomes kind of corrupt or becomes kind of curdled almost. And that you have to return to structure in order to give that kind of communitas moment its meaning, right? Um, yeah, let's see, how much time do we have? A little bit of time. Um, yeah, and it's about kind of reducing in these rituals, in this liminal state, oftentimes there's this kind of breaking apart of these important cultural things and using it as a form of education, oftentimes in this very heightened or almost monstrous form. And again, kind of going with the boot camp example, the drill sergeant, right? What does the drill sergeant do?
Yells at you, breaks you down, and makes you feel like you're just a piece
Yeah.
of the thing.
But there's also this kind of educational component, right? It's mean and right, it's aggressive, but there's this educational component, right? There's a reason for it. You're right. And so why initiate with these monsters, right? And he says that the exaggeration of these kind of monstrous figures, oftentimes these authority figures, putting on these masks or acting out these kind of exaggerated forms of culture that force us as people in that liminal state to reflect on our own self and our own society, right? To think about those categories. He gives the example of a Nadembu ritual, right? If you have a certain mask, will have these different features, whether it's kind of like big eyes or big head or big teeth, right? And it calls out these things and it makes them kind of think about them in a way, an exaggerated way, but in a way that you wouldn't normally do in society. And again, he says that kind of at the end, it's important to move beyond this communitas and you can't keep it going forever. You need to be reincorporated into society, right? The neophyte re-enters the structural realm. This is at the end of the wedding. The priest or the preacher says, I now pronounce you man and wife. Kiss the bride. You face the audience and everybody cheers because now you are reincorporated into society as this new state. But he says that you're no longer the same. Um, he gives this really interesting analogy of like the wax seal, right? You're the wax, and through this ritual, the wax is heated up and becomes malleable, and then kind of the ritual or the ritual authority figures acts as the stamp. And even after you're through the ritual and the wax is cooled, that stamp is left upon you, kind of going throughout your life. Um, yeah. And so for Turner, right, these rituals aren't just kind of magical. They're not just like talking about, oh, isn't that interesting, or isn't that a weird thing that those people do, or even that we do. But this becomes a form of understanding how societies function, or how they tend to work, right? How they process change. They often become this vehicle for understanding how conflict gets handled or resolved in society and are a way for us to teach culture to the new generation, right? If you have kids, you'll realize that kids don't like listen to you if you're like, let me tell you what American flag means, right? But going to these rituals, going to 4th of July or going to Christmas or going to Easter or Ash Wednesday or whatever, you see these things in practice and you don't necessarily get the full like exegesis about what's going on, but you absorb it and you live it and they're embodied. And that makes it a lot more powerful or meaningful in conveying or transferring these cultural ideas to the next generation because you're embodying it within yourself. And he says, yeah, and he uses again, kind of going back to the symbol. Through the symbol, the biological individual is periodically reshaped to the requirements of social order. So, what do you guys think about this Turner piece? We have about 5 minutes left. Let's get some of your impressions. What do you think about this?
I was mulling over the fact or the idea that life is just a series of liminal phases. But where does
Deep, man.
uniqueness occur? Does it occur when you're back, when you're in grade, or does it occur because of your perspective while you're in the space?
What do you mean uniqueness?
Well, if people are doing things to better the system or reinforce the system, where probably the answer is both. What
Yeah.
phase are you adding to the conversation?
Yeah, and I think he says it's both, right? It's the process, right? It's not necessarily like one or the other, but it's the act of going through rituals and going through this that you do create this kind of meaning rather than, it only happens in the liminal state. You need to have this kind of reincorporation. You go out into the wilderness to learn truth, but if you never bring it back to society, what good is it? I think is kind of the metaphor he would use. I think Turner stuff is really interesting to me because kind of like we talked about with Levi Strauss last time, it's one of the earlier things in anthropological theory that you can still be like, when somebody asks you or you're applying for grad school, what's your perspective going to be? You can be like, I'm going to study ritual from perspective of Vic Turner. And people are like, oh yeah. Versus like if you're like, I'm a structural functionalist, people are like, get out of here, right? We don't do that anymore. But this is still something that's potent today and still has a lot of purchase. And especially kind of this idea of communitas and the kind of structure of ritual, but I think the symbols as well, right? A lot of us are going to be doing a lot of this kind of stuff in our work, whether it's cultural or especially archaeology, right? What does this mean? What does this object, this artifact mean? And I think his symbolic structure, while it's often hard to, talk to people sometimes about what it might mean, kind of looking at what people say or dissent communities say about it, what the anthropological perspective is, and then combining that with the kind of material facets or material features of the thing, I think gives us a better way of trying to understand what these things mean, right? Because oftentimes, an arrowhead isn't just an arrowhead, right? It has this symbolic meaning as well. So I think it is a powerful kind of theory, and I think Edie is really great about kind of taking this to different contexts, right? And especially the kind of performative, embodied nature of this, right? Because she used to say that like you feel this in your body. And when I had the communitas and ritual class at Edie's house because she didn't like to go to campus anymore and teach, so she just had people in her living room and order pizza. But we would actually act out these rituals, right? Like the Nimbu healing rituals, you like lay on the ground and people like move things over you, or we go through, we're gonna practice chanting together and just see what that feels like, which is very like out of the ordinary for like a college class. But I think it's kind of essential for understanding kind of the embodiedness of it. And it's one of those things that it's super hard to be an armchair anthropologist about ritual, right? Like that to actually understand ritual is to go through it and to experience it and to be part of that communitas. Because if you just ask somebody what it feels like to go to boot camp, you're not going to get the same experience as actually living it. Okay. Any questions about ritual and symbolism, Vic Turner? Feel good about this? Feel like you understand? In many ways, this is kind of a synthesis of, and especially we'll talk about Mary Douglas next time as well. This kind of synthesis of like post-war British anthropology, moving beyond just how does this thing function, especially from like a colonial perspective. How does the new era function so we can colonize them? To this more this kind of symbolic understanding of how does culture work to maintain itself, but also to kind of pass these truths on to the next generation of society. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about Mary Douglas. She's going to be our last reading for pre-test one, and we'll be thinking about this idea of pollution and taboo and how maybe, again, how we can use this kind of linguistic metaphor to think about how symbols fit together in society. Okay, I'll see you all on Friday. Have a good day. Bye.
I have a lesson that's kind of making me look at things a lot different.
That's ideal. That's what we do here.
That's two theory classes
Huh?
back to back. I mean, these exaggerated symbols, how much do you think this is really just trying to structure the unknown, structure something that we can't fully explain?
Definitely.
More lives, like talking about the liminal religion plan. Is that why it's so exaggerated?
I think so, right? Because you have to make sense of these things which are beyond comprehension. So the exaggeration is a way, especially of instruction, right? Of teaching.
Yeah, because, going back to your kind of like, telling a kid about, like, if you're telling a kid about the religion, it's not gonna care about the ones and zeros, you're gonna care about this exaggerated idea.
Definitely. Or that like people don't get into religion or stay with religion, I guess, because of like reading textbooks about it or reading, this conversation between, theist and atheist and deciding which one. It's about having that kind of powerful experience, right? Like growing up and reading these books about religion is one thing, but like this, having these, especially in Belize, where you're like these nighttime rituals before they didn't have electricity then, so it's all with candles and it's all dark and there's shadows and there's crying babies and there's this very like really embodied context of what's going on, and you feel like the communitas of everyone there like singing or chanting together in a way that like reading about it you don't really get that.
That my grandma made me read the Bible was through the Action Bible.
Hmm.
It was made into a graphic novel.
Yeah.
Still an action read it. I ended up adopting one with this by the end, but like it was still cool. I took a good look at it. So
Well, thanks. Have a great day.
you too.
Do you have 2 minutes?
Definitely.
Okay. I was gonna see.